Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Pokemon Go, check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your order using that code Omnipoke. For today's video, we're continuing with some Worlds deck spotlights. This time we're going to be looking at the Mewtwo VUnion Control deck, which Sander brought to light at the NAIC with a very impressive top 4 finish. Let's get into the general strategy, and that is we want to cycle as much as possible here. We are trying to get down to the depths of our deck so that we can cycle lots of combinations throughout the entire game. All the while, we're going to be solving a mini quest, which is going to be getting all 4 pieces of Mewtwo VUnion into that discard pile. Now, in many matchups, this is going to be your go-to option to continue the game without giving up prize cards, simply by using the Super Regeneration attack on Mewtwo here. You can power it up simply by using a Union game the turn it comes into play. Then you are using this regeneration to heal 200 damage each turn, and there's many ways we can reduce the damage of many archetypes. We can use the likes of Tooljammer to remove Choice Belt's damage. We can be limiting Palkia's bench size with the likes of Avery. Obviously, in general, Arceus isn't hitting too high a threshold. It hits either 180 or 200 based on if it has a double turbo or not. And we have extra healing cards in the list so that we don't just get crumbed immediately if they do a couple bits of damage over that 200 threshold over a number of turns. You can sometimes weave in Cook or PCL to heal that off throughout the entire game. And whilst we're doing this healing effect, we're trying to loop Silene either to recover things like Crushing Hammer or trying to get boss's orders over and over again, essentially trying to buy free turns here and there, if need be, to speed up the game, to final burn, knock things out, or to use that Psy-Splosion attack as well. Of course, you never need to actually do this, it just speeds up your win condition, so under timed conditions, trying to find these windows to use Final Burn and Psy-Splosion are important to you, but as long as you're using Super Regeneration every turn and not leaking too much damage, essentially, you will deck out the opponent, because you essentially never deck out with your own deck. Even though we get all the way to the bottom, we're going to try and use Silene, Team Yell's Cheer, and Palpad in a loop to never run out of resources on our end. So simply by having a deck that, or coming up against a deck that can't do more than 200 damage, you basically instantly win on the spot. And in a handful of other matchups where potentially they can have that higher damage threshold, or even can be hitting for weakness in certain instances, you can also try a Miltank approach, where you run the opponent out of Miltank answers, and then Miltank sits there all game and either routes to start taking prize cards, or is again going to use the Silene Palpad loop to prevent deck out on its own end whilst decking out the opponent. So really, the game goes in 2 stages, where initially you're trying to Gourmandize as much as possible, using cards like Galarian Meowth and your Ball Search cards to lower your hand down as quickly as possible, Gourmandize, gobble up deeper into your deck, and then there comes a turning point where you've sacrificed a few prize cards, and then the wall is built. Whether it's Mewtwo VUnion or it's Miltank, either way, you're going to present this situation that the opponent, in theory, can't deal with, and then you just stop giving up prize cards, and the opponent then has to draw every time it's their turn, and that's how the deck typically is aiming to win the game. On to the matchup spread then, and I think this is actually a really interesting one, because of course in online tournaments they are different time-wise than IRL, where sometimes it's best of 1, sometimes it's half an hour, compared to a best of 3 50-minute. And I think that's actually really important for the Mewtwo VUnion deck, because in some of these online events you may be given a loss or a tie or whatever, when in a longer game situation you would have won. So the matchup spread is actually pretty strange for this deck, so just something to bear in mind. This is one of the most suspect matchup spreads I've seen, but this is just based on the Trainer Hill data throughout July. So let's have a look here. First of all, some tasty stuff at the top. Decent into Arceus Flying Peak, which is interesting because we actually saw Azul beating it on stream at the NAIC, and that was potentially down to the top cut rules, of course. That being said, the Arc Peak, I can see it being somewhat of a headache because it does come with Phoebe Palpad. It comes packing a huge number of Marnies, and it has a Crobat attacking option. Now, As the Mewtwo side of things, you're going to try and remove enough energies from the Crobat, so that's a non-factor. Then you can bring in the Mewtwo and wall the entire game, or you can represent a third Miltank, so you beat Phoebe Palpad. Those are your two different directions. You should actually be good in those instances, so as long as you take those directions, you should be okay, despite the soft answers currently in the Arc Pikachu. Bliss Tank is also very favourable. They don't have very good Miltank answers, surprisingly enough. You can constantly be healing their tiny chips of route damage that they do if you just leave one Miltank in play the entire game, which is great for you. You just have to get around Tornadus, essentially, which is the potentially scariest thing. Turbo Palkia, again, not enough sort of attacking presence. They don't come with Inteleon, so they have much worse times around your Miltank. And Urshifu Inteleon struggles with the amount of energy it can use to attack with Inteleon in the first place, and has a low enough damage threshold that a Mewtwo can get the job done as well in that instance. You're pretty favourable into Mew. Now, that's really down to you trying to spam as much energy disruption as possible and give up as many like 1 prizes as you can throughout the game, and try and use that Yveltal as much as possible. That's your main win condition here, just trying to aggressively find those hammers and use Yveltal maybe a couple times in a game. Your Zoro matchup seems to be okay. I'm not too sure where to put my finger on this one. I just don't think they have many easy ways to knock out Miltank, surprisingly enough. Even though they have a ton of 1-prize Pokemon, they don't actually carry things that can deal with Miltank in one hit too easily, and that can actually buy you a lot of time. And even the Snorlax to an extent as well. If they just keep a low bench size against the Zoroark, you get a lot of time against them, and you can try and weave in that Mewtwo. And despite they have Zoroark, they don't often have any other like very powerful dark attackers, like possibly a Mightyena, and even then they have to attach 3 energy to it. So you should be okay in this regard. I think it's relatively favourable, although they can come up with some tricks here and there to be aware of. For even matchups, this is surprising to me, we have some even arc variants. The Duraludon, I can see that being somewhat of a headache because it does pack more than 200 damage at its disposal, and it obviously wall breaks through the Miltank, so they can't buy you turns and time to breathe and draw through your deck. So they keep you pretty honest, and they force you to flip enough heads with Silene enough times to weave in hammers to get rid of their fighting energies in time, or to weave in those Cook supporters to get enough heals to outdo the bit of extra chip damage they're coming in with the Duraludon. So they mostly just keep you honest, I would say. Arc Inteleon, again, fairly even. They come bearing a couple Marnies and Palpads at their disposal. They have Inteleons that they can attack with to get through Miltank slowly as well. But I can definitely foresee a late game situation where you get the job done against them. Again, you sort of get around their Inteleon ping chip damage here and there with the help of your supporter loops. They just make you flip enough heads of Silene over a decent period of time here. The Ice Rider seems pretty even, which is interesting to me because, of course, they can be smacking that 250 over and over again, but really it's down to how often they can chain that. They're limited to how many Melanies they have available to them, and you can try and slow them down in that regard. They, of course, have Inteleon as well, so you can try and do some strange trapping plays, weave in the Miltank, extend the game here and there, and again, heal the Mewtwo when need be. The Palkia Inteleon, again, interestingly enough, is only in that even category. It doesn't often come with a lot of hand disruption, usually just 1 Marnie, if any, and the Roxanne's probably never going to be activated. It's really down to the Mewtwo Miltank player to reduce their bench size, reduce their damage overall, and be aware of their burst potential. Sometimes a Palkia can burst a good amount with Leon, with Echoing Horn, with a Choice Belt coming down on a turn, like at the same time as maybe some Inteleon ping net plays, so they can get a little bit sneaky with their damage and have some push potential to be aware of, and just to sort of keep that in mind when you're playing on the safe side with this deck, because if you don't play on the safe side, you can just get blown out all in one turn, so something to be a little bit aware of. Malamar seems even, and I don't know how. Malamar should be absolutely destroying you, honestly, but the stats are showing that it's only even right now. There hasn't been many games of this matchup, to be fair, but Malamar should smash Mewtwo, in my opinion. Stonejourner, again, don't know how this is even. You should auto-win Stonejourner, so I'm just confused by the online results. The Dialga is potentially troublesome, seeing as though they can try and take a couple turns on you early on, I think especially is where it's worrying, where you've only got a couple Snorlax into play, or even if they take 2 Snorlax out on the same, like, in air quotes, same turn, or before you can respond, I guess, and then they just leave you with like a Meowth in play and you just stop drawing cards and your engine kind of sputters. That's where things can get a little bit dodgy. Other than that, I'm not seeing much headache here, although they do have a good amount of energy recovery and this sort of thing, but they, again, don't pack too many Miltank answers. unless they're going to go for the one prize Dialga, which is a potential tech include if they choose to. And Reggie's also is a little bit awkward. Of course, they have the option to use Regice. Now, Regice only works if they have Path of the Peak in their list because of Mewtwo VUnion's ability. But if they are playing Path and they are playing that Regice and you're not playing Parasol, that's a lot of things happening all at once. It can be an issue. Of course, they get through the Miltanks easy peasy, and they put you on a pretty honest clock to use that Mewtwo effectively. But if you can, and they aren't playing Path, or if you are playing Parasol, you should be okay. So it's really your own, choose your own destiny against the Reggies if you want to tech against it or not. Some other unfavorables, Mewtwo's an interesting, the Gyarados, I should say, is an interesting one. They have two pretty troublesome attacks with the Gyarados. One removes energy from your Mewtwo, which is scary, so you need to have a constant flow of energy attachments so you can continue to heal. And whilst they are doing that, they also have a 240 damage attack, so they can also come through with higher than 200 damage to again threaten you with just a constant heal of 200 not quite being enough. You are leaking, and that's something you need to be playing around the whole game. Arc Mewtwo I've just started to add onto the spreadsheet because it's starting to pick up some online popularity. Also seems unfavorable. You're both going to be using Mewtwo's against each other, and because Mewtwo can Psysplosion and it can hit that 300 threshold as well, of course, it can do a huge chunk, and it's always going to Union game back energies, so it's not really ever going to run out, and that is, of course, an issue for you. And the Psysplosion gets around Miltank as well, so a little bit awkward there. The Inteleon toolbox, the one prize box, also seems pretty awkward. I can't really put my finger on it. I guess there will be a decent amount of Intel boxes that are still using an amount of dark energy, I would assume. Of course, they do have enough one prizes to at least get through Miltanks and whatnot, but they probably aren't running much hand disruption, and the Mewtwo probably... Like, you should be able to get around the Mewtwo, really. You should be able to hammer away Charizard, and they have to, move the Charizard in and out of the active if that's going to be the main focus. So, not too sure about this one, unless they can try and combine some crazy turns where they go for, like, Intel pings all in one turn alongside, like, a belted Zard and just one-hit KO a Mewtwo. I guess they have the time to sort of accumulate those resources, and that could be a factor here. And then finally we have Luna Rock. This actually is genuinely a very, very bad matchup because you can't deny their energies. They have tons of ways to move other like stall targets out the way, and they are just coming in with that Lunatone that can go over the top of a Mewtwo, easily hitting over 200 damage, and they can just one-hit KO, to be honest, and obviously Miltank is doing nothing. So the matchup spread is really odd. I would definitely push Malamar up. I would push Stonjourner up. I personally would push Palkia up as well. Of the top decks, I'd probably push the Arc Peak down one, but still call it mildly favorable. Outside of this, yeah, it seems okay. I would imagine the Intel box is slightly more favorable than is showing in the data right now, but a really interesting spread for the Mewtwo based on the online results. And again, take this with a massive pinch of salt. Onto a skeleton list then. I'm going to keep things very straightforward and simplistic, very similar to Sander's list, because who am I to say that you should change anything that Sander made, because he's a fantastic control player and puts a lot of time into his list and perfected it with some other of my teammates, Maze Brenninkmeyer, and they made a very straightforward list with a good amount of consistency here to just cycle to the bottom of the deck. You can see maximizing the shoes, the quick ball, and the ultra balls with a ton of discard here. Galarian Meowth, at least it's going to be a 1 count, but it could be important enough to double up on this guy. We have some Flanneries for some energy disruption alongside the Crushing Hammers. At the same time, Flannery can remove some pesky stadium cards. You have Silene, Palpad, and Yelchir as your infinite loop, essentially, is what we go for here. So having just one-off copies is fine when you can guarantee infinite uses of them throughout the entire game, and obviously Silene can get any card back, so you have access once again to energy cards, you have access to item cards if you want to reuse these as well. So that's kind of the whole gist here. The other sort of tech Pokemon, Pyukumuku, can just sort of fix your bottom deck, I guess you could say. It forces itself to the bottom and you get to draw an additional card. It just lets you see more in the opening stages, of course, and when you're in this sort of Yelchir Silene loop, the pitch is also very helpful where you can instantly access the Silene card, for example. So very, very strong card. The Yveltal is mostly for the Mew matchup. Everything else is pretty straightforward, I would say. The Tool Jammer, essential for trying to deny the choice belt math in most instances, and also has the small perk of allowing you to trap air balloon stuff with boss's orders as well. onto some tech options then. And if we're just going to fill out the cards that were played in Sanders' list, I think it was a second copy of Meowth, a second copy of Yveltal. It was an extra twin energy, and then it was Sydney to give yourself extra energy disruption and stadium disruption. It was the Cape and the Parasol. Cape obviously helping out against Inteleon mostly, so you can just survive more hits and give yourself more time. You can even do some nice net picking up and putting down of Miltanks to deny prizes. You can use this Parasol as a tech card for Regis mostly, surprisingly, so you can attack into a Regice unscathed. And of course, you currently can do that as long as the Regi player isn't playing Path, but if they do play Path, you need the Parasol. So what's that? That's 5 cards, and then they had 2 others, which I'm currently forgetting. Oh, Rose Tower was one of them, and some other additional count of a card that I'm currently forgetting. But regardless, we're very close to Sanders' list from the skeleton, and there's a few other options that you could definitely consider. There's some potential other Pokemon you could think about. Radiant Venusaur being a new addition from Pokemon Go, where you can get some additional cards here and there with Sunny Bloom. Obviously, most of the time, it's not going to be in effect as long as you're using your Gourmandize, but if you're going to try and give the opponent harder prizes from the outset and just have Miltank up in center, out in the open, you can try and get some extra Sunny Bloom cards, and it just gives you some natural protection on board against early Marnies that many people try and do against you. Same can really be said for the Oranguru, where the Wisdom can do a similar role to the Pitcher Pukamuku in that late game. But in the early stages, it can be a card to protect against a Marnie, where you're making sure you're putting a card on top. It has some minor anti-synergy, though, of course, because if you're Gourmandizing, you're just redrawing that card regardless, so not quite as perfect as I like, but it's kind of better in the sort of mid-game than anything else, just to see extra cards here and there, and to fix like potential awkward Ultra Balls or Quick Balls or anything like that, or just see extra cards. And Capture Energy is not the best in this list because you have so many 2 energy retreat cost Pokemon. That's why you see the high count of Twin. But Capture just, again, gives you that peace of mind that you're seeing more Snorlax in the opening stages, so you're not going to get crumbed just by the opponent aggressively spamming your hand with Marnie. So all these are kind of Marnie protection cards, I guess you could say. Speaking of Marnie, you could play it yourself for some hand disruption against others. I've said a few times how you can sometimes just get wrecked by big, like 5-card combos from people. So weaving in a Marnie can try and disrupt that and force them to rebuild in certain instances. Roxanne's definitely the epitome of that, where you really put them on a low hand. Sometimes just one Crushing Hammerheads on a Roxanne at the right time buys you a free turn, and suddenly you're swinging at them for 300 damage, and they're in a whole heap of trouble. So it can really turn the game on a dime and put you into the ascendancy way faster. I think that's the most important thing. Like, Roxanne doesn't help you win the game necessarily, but it helps you win faster. And you actually need to think about these things when we're talking about Worlds, because tying is the enemy. You do not want to find yourself in that position. So if you Roxanne and just get like a Hammerheads or whatever else to disrupt the opponent on the same turn, even just the Roxanne itself can be enough, where you get that breathing space, and suddenly then the Mewtwo's swinging and it's taken the biggest threat off the board, or the only Miltank answer they had, this, that, or the other, and you're going to like cruise to victory. So these are decent cards to bear in mind to disrupt combos mostly. And then the other new card from Pokemon Go is Pokestop, allowing you to cycle. Again, that is kind of the name of the deck, and whatever hits the discard pile, in theory, you should be okay, because you have the infiniteness of Palpad, Silene, Yelchir. So it would have to be a horrific Pokestop gone wrong if you are going to lose based off of this card. And in general, it's safe enough for you to just see more Quicken Ultra Balls in the opening stages. And you can use it just carefully in general. I think you certainly want to play at least a stadium, so you have some bounce to Path. So that's always something you want to think about. And also Training Court, of course, if Crushing Hammer is going to be part of your means of getting freedom to attack with your Mewtwo, if that makes sense. So having some sort of stadium is certainly important. And I personally still like Rose Tower as Marnie protection, but Pokestop is certainly a reasonable one, and Sydney can also be considered, certainly. Onto the example 60, and I think this is just one card different from... Actually, it's 2 cards different from Maze's 60. And Sanders, of course. So we are going to be cutting a Yveltal, because I think there's less Mew in the metagame, but that's just a personal preference from me. I would still respect Mew for Worlds, but I'm just going to put the 1 Yveltal in and hope that possibly I can Yelchir or Silene recover it in time, as well as just hitting more heads on hammers and finding my Flanneries in time. You should be okay, touch wood. And also I have cut the Parasol because, again, I'm not expecting a huge amount of Reggies day one of Worlds. So in those spots, I've gone for a second copy of Avery and a second copy of Marnie. Now, both of these cards serve the purpose of you surviving Marnie from opponents, of course, which is already a big tick in your favor because you're just drawing more cards throughout the game, because you don't actually play that many draw supporters. You have the Researchers, now the Marnie, and now the extra copy of Avery. Peonia isn't quite a draw supporter, but it lets you see more cards that can potentially be helpful. Of course, you need to weave in these Peonias oftentimes to get pieces of your Mewtwo in the first place, so you're always going to play those Peonias proactively. But just having a higher volume of supporters is very helpful. The Marnie being that combo disruptor, and the Avery being a faster means of slowing down a Palkia, which I also think is pretty important. So I really like the second copy of the Avery here. Makes the most sense for me. We're kind of like narrowing our metagame with this deck list, where we're not respecting Reggies and we're less respecting Mew, in the hope that we are just more consistent and getting the job done against most people just trying to disrupt us in the opening stages and holding their breath that they can get through just like one or two Snorlax and hope they're done there before we've got into our Wombo combo. On to my closing thoughts then. I do believe this is a pretty solid option if you are expecting a narrow metagame, and I know that Arceus is certainly going to be a popular archetype, Palkia is certainly going to be a popular archetype, and Mew, maybe less so than the other two, but still a popular archetype nonetheless, and you can definitely target those decks by playing Mewtwo VUnion, and that's always a good strategy if you're going to be targeting the most popular decks in the room. I do believe that this deck does it better than most, and also it's one of the most simple control decks in recent times. Unlike some other Sander creations where literally only Sander can play it to a sort of high enough level to get good results, now pretty much anyone can play this list. It's actually very, very straightforward. You just need to stick to some key principles where you have enough cards to not lose to, like, a Marnie, where you just draw your entire deck and deck yourself out. You're constantly being reserved in how many heads you need to flip with your Silene, or at least you're monitoring that risk where you know how many Palpad are remaining, you know how many Silenes you need to flip, you know if you have that Yelchir in circulation. You're always being reserved in that regard, and you also need to know your fastest route to start attacking with Mewtwo. That's kind of the main end game here, where it's either hammering the opponent out, or it's like finding something you can trap and run them out of switch cards, these sorts of things. Whatever's the fastest route in that loop, whilst you're using that healing from Mewtwo, then lets you turn it on a dime and start doing your spread shenanigans or taking knockouts if you think it's safe. There may be some matchups, for example, against a Radiant Zard, where it's not safe for you to take prizes and you simply have to deck them the old-fashioned way where they draw a card each turn and then deck. So these are things to consider based on each matchup. And then for some negatives, time. Time has always been a huge issue for controlling decks, none more so than Worlds, because people will already be angry to be playing against you in the first place, so they may not feel too excited about having a gentleman's agreement against a control player. It's always a more difficult one to carve out with someone. It's not as easy as just saying whoever's ahead on prize cards. It's going to be more of a debate, certainly, and you're not going to get them in a good frame of mind, I would imagine. And at the same merit, if the opponent steals a win against you, for example, they just Marnie knock out Snorlax, and then you have to send up like a Miltank, and then you can't draw any cards, and they find a way to knock out that Miltank over like 2 turns or whatever, you've lost game 1, and you're going into games 2 and 3 really knowing that your win condition can take up to 40 minutes on its own, and that can just put you straight out of contention, and losses are obviously something you need to be careful of, and even ties are something you need to be very careful of at Worlds. So even if you are able to squeeze out that second win and bring it to a tie, ties are way worse in this scenario than in regular regionals, so a big concern there. And finally, you can lose on the spot to tech cards. If people want to target you in certain ways, we have seen some of these tech cards start sneaking into deck lists. We're seeing things like Empoleon V to shut down the draw from Snorlax, as well as the protection that Miltank provides. We're starting to see potentially Crabominable coming into some of these decks, so that when you're in that Silene Palpad loop, they can just start milling 2 off the top, or they can put some chip damage onto the Mewtwo, and it becomes way more dangerous because they have such a high damage multiplier on their Crabominable. They can actually attack and take KOs on the Mewtwo as well. We're seeing things like Crobat VMAX still in a number of toolbox Arceus. We're seeing some Hisuian Decidueye finding a way into some of these Arceus builds as well. as additional Miltank answers, more so than just Phoebe Palpad, because we're expecting that third Miltank in this day and age. We're seeing things like Ninetales V to actually copy the attacks of the Mewtwo VUnion. So there's some interesting tech cards here and there floating around. I don't know necessarily how popular they will be for Worlds. They may be a little bit too cute, and people leading up to the event may cut them. But at the same merit, if you flip your basic Arceus or your basic Palkia into having one tech include, you completely can turn the matchup on its head, because this deck is so delicate at what it's trying to achieve. You can completely lose on the spot based on the tech includes that people go for. So that's also a big concern, knowing that this is now a known quantity. People potentially will be respecting this archetype for Worlds. It's getting enough online results still that it's clearly a strong deck in the game, and if people choose to respect this deck, it could have a much more difficult time. So let me know your thoughts of Mewtwo Miltank. Are you going to be playing VUnion Control, making space on that playmat for the big Mewtwo? It's always great fun to see that in action in person, because it's real crazy. But yeah, you got to have some cojones to bring this deck to Worlds, in my opinion, because you're living on the edge, knowing that if one person respects you, they could just take the win immediately against you. And that's always a pretty bad feeling in my book. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.